The amenitization of nature. The potent conflict created by searching for nature in nominally working landscapes is hidden quite well in the landscape aesthetic of Exurbia, in which landscape is often valued for its primarily visual and aesthetic amenity values above other values. This valuation contributes to reshaping exurban landscapes around their potential amenity functions, amenitizing the landscape. By choosing to move to farmland or another resource landscape, and then by reforesting it, exurbanites demonstrate both an interest in inhabiting the working landscape and also a sense of discomfort with what the working landscape represents vis-a-vis the relationship between ideals of nature and human agency in the environment. Reforestation, and relating to trees more generally, is clearly considered to have many benefits. However, by allowing reforestation on the farms, woodlots, ranches, and other working landscapes where exurbia has largely been built, exurbanites are acting out a conflict between, on one hand, an aestheticized interest in the kind of landscapes and landscape processes that provide the material resources on which daily life is based, and, on the other hand, dismissive negative evaluations of the way such resources are procured that may be largely implicit. Imagery of the exurbanizing rural landscape draws heavily on ideals of wilderness, and on the imagined social and aesthetic world of the traditional productive landscapes that exurbia is replacing, forest and farmland. Because nature is thought of as wilderness, and because traditional rural practices have been naturalized and made aesthetic, however, exurbia ends up consuming this aesthetic of forest and farmland rather than reproducing it. Conspicuous wooden furniture and wooden architecture, grand lawns, and graceful hedgerows and woodlots replace the working landscape with lush crops of houses, nestled in amongst the nature, manifested and ornamented by trees, and flavored by wilderness. Dominant cultural narratives of nature, such as those associated with the amenity values of the modern pastoral, appear to lead to modes of interaction with the natural environment that inhibit thorough examination of goals symbolized by nature and by trees. In discussions of exurban land use, green space, and especially exurban forests, nature seems to be uncritically understood in such a way that its status is almost automatically naturalized and privileged as the way things should be. It is in this kind of unreflexive normative functioning of trees that the modern pastoral can be seen to work as a mode of the ideology of nature. Approval of aestheticized forest landscapes as green and environmentally good smooths over potentially uncomfortable dissonances or contradictions in the everyday experiences and impacts of green sprawl. Exurban treatments of trees demonstrate some of the key difficulties that define the struggle with the modern pastoral. If residents of exurban forests become alienated from the processes of forest use and forest growth, and turn away from the reality of the forest and society around them, trees end up being fetishized into a magical manifestation of nature, subject neither to processes of human culture nor death. The pastoral blurs important differences between the ways that nature is perceived and discussed and the ways in which the natural environment is used and interacted with. Refocusing on these differences and grappling explicitly with obstacles to seeing them plainly may provide insight into the difficulties inherent in inhabiting landscapes that are understood to be natural. The importance of understanding the process of imbuing nature with moral imperatives becomes particularly clear in the way that forests, reforestation, and the regeneration of native ecosystems are used to naturalize assumptions about the way landscapes should be, as well as to protect landscapes and their protectors from changes or manifestations of social relations that are uncomfortable. Trees mark landscapes as significant, and exurban consternation in the face of both urban and rural land use processes often manifests as unwillingness to kill trees, either to make way for new housing or urban infrastructure, or to manage forests for timber and habitat. Exurban trees provide an example of the way in which the ideology of nature pits environmental goals, usually framed in terms of sustainability in ways that at least imply inter- and intra-generational environmental justice, against everyday behaviors that often call such terms into question. In fact, most of the broader trends and conflicts concentrated in Exurbia are well represented by the idealization of trees. This idealization has permeated visual culture and environmental ethics and was evident in my research, as well as in the literature on Exurbia, in the intense growth in the popularity and amount of forested Exurbia and its representation as a desirable residential landscape. The way trees function symbolically in Exurbia opens a window onto encounter with the natural environment and may provide insight into the socio-environmental goals that Exurbia represents and the behaviors it facilitates. Perspectives on Exurbia are various, and struggle over the interpretation of what any landscape represents or how it functions is constant. But especially in its representations in the inviting landscapes around North American cities, the natural exurban landscape of solace and escape functions as a modern pastoral landscape, presented as an ideal toward which residents, or at least consumers of housing, are supposed to orient their aspirations. Understanding the aspirations embedded in exurban landscapes may help explain why impulses toward exploring and engaging with the myriad problems of shaping residential landscapes so often end, even unwittingly, in escape. This perspective on environmental goals and behaviors, and obstacles to these goals and behaviors, might assist in finding new and alternative ways to situate the search for nature within present environmental realities, and to turn interest in exploring the potentials of the environment towards smaller, everyday, practical goals having to do with making residential landscapes inhabitable. Forests as desirable habitat. Goals for residential settings are partly defined by ideals of habitation, the everyday process of living in landscapes and of learning to shape the environment in everyday life to suit each other. Aspirations for habitation include specific goals for what might be done with home and property, but also include less material aspirations, goals that may be symbolic or aesthetic, or even just vague. In the context of sustainability-inspired improvement efforts, however, there's an important difference between improving the ways people inhabit environments and aspiring to inhabit better environments. If a quest for a better life is achieved by setting up a utopian haven somewhere out there and escaping the everyday world here, by buying into the conviction that life out in the idyllic countryside might be inherently and effortlessly better, a lot of the energy that might have gone into making already inhabited environments better gets shifted into finding out that the new environments have many of the same problems as the old ones, usually brought by the very process of escaping. This is a central paradox of Exurbia. How can the cyclic reproduction of the problems of sprawl be addressed? Many people have studied the problems caused by escaping home environments that don't live up to the ideal. And over the past 50 years, a central suite of problems has come to be recognized under names such as urban flight, the last settler syndrome, and rurbanization. As one hopefully ideal landscape after another is transformed and then escaped, cities, and then suburbs, and then outer suburbs, lose their desirability as a place to live. Scholarship on the creative destruction of exurbanization and gentrification suggests both that ideal landscapes, no matter how scenic, are never as ideal as they might be, and also that idealizing landscapes has significant socio-environmental costs. In the places escaped from, and also those escaped to, residents may feel themselves alienated from their environmental ideals, at least partly because nature ideals often fail to include other humans. The whole process of idealizing nature appears to make it considerably more difficult to engage with actually lived-in material environments. It is difficult to read the history of exurban land use planning and not wonder about better ways to structure urbanization to help people get a grip on better aligning their ideal and material environments. Despite consensus about the desirability of containing the impact of green sprawl, or at least reducing the prevalence of exurbanites achieving private gain at public expense via environmentalist rhetoric without demonstrated benefit, methods for such planning have been scarce. Repeated defeats of various planning measures suggest the usefulness of building political will and socio-environmental literacy to put pressure on self-deceptive, escapist, and segregating manifestations of green sprawl. Exurbia does represent, in part, a simple escape from cities to the most available natural landscapes. However, much more interestingly, it also represents a more complex escape from uneasy relationship with the larger environment. The impulse that drives so many exurbanites to a landscape that represents, or aesthetically demonstrates, the way resources are procured may be escapist, although it may also contain potentially more critical and reflexive aspirations for socio-environmental engagement. However well-intentioned this aspiration, though, American and Canadian attempts to inhabit Exurbia tend to falter, and instead degenerate to a commodified form of escape that resolutely sees the forests of humanized landscapes as not demonstrating human intervention. Intensive consultation with exurban residents around Toronto, in New England, and in Christchurch has led me to argue that some of the most troubling stumbling blocks obstructing the aspirations of exurbanites involve conflicts between cultural understandings of nature and of resource production. Exurbia provides an opportunity to learn quite a lot from the way nature and the countryside are idealized and used to define and privilege particular goals. It also demonstrates the difficulties that are involved in reconciling assumptions about urban places, places where many people live, with expectations of interacting with the environments that are natural or rural. The desire to move away from a more humanized landscape quite often includes an urge to find or shape some version of nature. The urge to explore, to interact with and shape the environment, is often linked in this formulation to the impulse to escape to an ideal better place. In my experience researching the history of Euro-American urbanization and interviewing residents who have moved out of cities or suburbs into Exurbia, however, I have come to believe that a great number of aspiring exurbanites wish not only to escape the problems of their previous everyday environments, but to find in a residential setting the potential for engaging intellectually, politically, and materially with some of the issues they see as important to a practice of reflexive habitation. In order to understand this engagement and escape, I find the idea of the modern pastoral helpful to look more closely at what exurbanites mean by natural, and also what it might mean to engage with something like nature, or to inhabit it. Modern pastoral. Epigraph 1. I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Henry David Thoreau, Walden. Epigraph 2. The story of Romulus and Remus being suckled by a wolf is not a meaningless fable. The founders of every state which has risen to eminence have drawn their nourishment and vigor from a similar wild source. It is because the children of the empire were not suckled by the wolf that they were conquered and displaced by the children of the northern forests, who were. Henry David Thoreau, Walking. The question of what motivates the search for nature has been extensively considered in literary and cultural studies, especially in the context of the pastoral, as a theme concerning the conflicts between nature, often represented by an idealized image of landscape, and the artifice of human design. This analysis of the pastoral also addresses attempts to reconcile these conflicts between nature and artifice, and the term has traditionally been applied to what Leo Marx designated middle landscapes, environments between the built-up city and the remote hinterland, or environments such as nature-themed suburbs, or the exurbia that replaces timberland and farmland. This pastoral is a compromise between the human mark and the landscape, and a hope that the landscape will do its own thing in the spaces left between the obviously human parts, not unlike the gap between imagined and real landscapes. In their examination of the effects of an ideology of the pastoral on the process of residential subdivision, rural sociologist John Fairweather and landscape architect Simon Swafield discuss the Arcadian manifestation of the pastoral, confirming the tendency of pastoral landscapes to appear where urban realities, encountered daily through commuting, are intentionally effaced by largely illusory rural landscapes in which agriculture is used mainly to keep up an appearance of the rural. In his classic treatise on the wishful imagination of rural living, Raymond Williams traces this Arcadian pastoral back through millennia of literature to classical Greece, exposing the irony in the pastoral. The pastoral landscapes popularized in painting and literature by the European elite were made possible by just the sort of labor this elite avoided, exploited, and tried to keep out of view. Further, the Greek region of Arcadia, archetype of pastoral landscape for this European elite, is a rough mountainous one, not at all the lush respite the poets had made it. Discussing these ironies and an analysis of the phenomenon of the fundamentally exurban country house, William McClung calls the pastoral Arcadia a dreamscape, a state of wish fulfillment that stands in dramatic contrast to the experience of everyday life. Literary scholar Robin McGowan elaborates the pastoral both as a contrast to everyday life and as a promise of wish fulfillment, but also as explicitly illusory. McGowan describes the development of the pastoral in literature as a form seeking to project within certain arbitrary limits a vision of the good life. The viewer creates this pastoral view by setting those particular limits that will depict the good life, and the landscape allows viewers the opportunity to dream of what through it we can become. In the way that trees in the landscape are made to bear the burden of fulfilling goals and desires, exurbanites project a pastoral vision of the environment. They may be in love with the dream of what, through ideal environments, they can become. When they forget that they have imagined this pastoral vision into being, however, it becomes all too possible to mistake the imagined landscapes of escape for the real, and to elude not only what it appears possible to flee from, but also the possibility of engaging with the landscape fled to. Understanding exurban imagined landscapes as a manifestation of the pastoral reveals similarities across a range of different idealized escape landscapes. Aestheticized working landscape and wilderness provide destinations that invite escape, flight from conditions of modernity that might be better addressed if faced rather than escaped. The disjuncture in the simultaneous intense appreciation for nature and substantial denial of its material appropriation, for example, is one of the contradictions that a critical understanding of the pastoral vision of Exurbia appears to potentially help reconcile. If the stresses of the lifestyle of high-density modern urbanity can be seen as representing what makes residential islands in the midst of nature seem necessary, the modern pastoral is part of what makes plausible the utopian vision of Exurbia as those islands. And the modern here, as used in the description of the exurbanites I've researched, is a big tent. What social scientists analyze in terms of the exaggerated inequalities and precariousness of late capitalism, the hyper-modernity experienced as everyday life that has become more integrated in state and market operations, many exurbanites referred to as the rat race, a system many critiqued, either because of its effects on them or because they were self-conscious that they benefited from this system so that they could afford to live in Exurbia, while most do not. The move out to Exurbia superficially escapes the landscapes identified with modernity. Exurbia is riddled with representations of the good life that make reference to the good old days with tokens of resistance, to some of the socio-environmental changes involved in urbanization, for example, which can serve as a stand-in representing an aesthetic understanding of modernity. This resistance is itself amenitized, ironically displaying class distinction by invoking folksy aesthetics that appear to value working-class rurality. Neo-traditional village architecture and street furniture echo the old quality usually read into forests, while their wildness is being emphasized. Forested green spaces and trees are preserved as symbols of community values, and forestation is encouraged to conserve the placidity of the unworked landscape, such as that described by Raymond Williams in The City and the Country. But these images of nostalgia do not explicitly elaborate, and in fact usually obscure what is being resisted by the escape into nature. What is different between now and then, here and there? What is better in Exurbia than in the place escaped? In the same way that trees represent immortality and the vital, authentic life of nature invoked so often via Thoreau quotations, such as those I used to begin this section, in many ways the city, as such, has come to represent the changes of modernity, as well as the speed and intensity of modern life. Against the overwhelming rush of this modernity, the amenitized hinterlands of green sprawl beckon welcomingly as a place where North Americans seem to think pastoral sanity might be recovered, but people can't or don't escape modernity just by moving to the woods.